friends, I'm Michellemarki, and over the coming decades, many Americans will be experiencing this phenomenon called the Great Wealth Transfer, where 45 million households made up mostly of baby boomers who were born between the years 1946 through 1964 will be passing on their wealth that's at least $30 trillion to as much as $68 trillion onto future generations of millennials who were born between 1981 through 1996, and also Gen Xers who were born between 1965 through 1980. And out of this whole group, that's about 136 million people who might stand to benefit from inheriting IRAs, 401ks, and Roth IRAs. And that means that out of the lowball figure of $30 trillion, each of the Gen X and millennials could inherit $220,000 per person. And if you're married to someone, that might be $440,000 that a couple could inherit. So as much as we don't want our elders to pass away, at least there's a little bit of a financial bonus if it sadly comes to pass. And so I'll talk about what it means if we were to inherit IRAs mostly. And the rules for 401ks might be slightly different because 401ks are employer sponsored usually, and they might have some of their own rules. But for the most part, there's a lot of similarities, and new tax rules for inheriting these retirement accounts went into law with the passing of the Secure Act at the end of 2019, which took effect for any inherited accounts starting in 2020 and beyond. And even though some of these rules introduce some complicated things that are actually being questioned right now, and the IRS will make some final interpretations hopefully in 2022. So although not all the final rules are completely set in stone, this is sort of what we have to go with. But there is some light at the end of the tunnel where millennials could stand to have 5 times as much wealth by 2030 based on what they might have had in 2018, which was around $4.5 trillion. And by 2030, they could have as much as $20 trillion, which is like compounding your wealth by 13.3% over 12 years, which is really great. And some of that is from our own personal investing and saving. And another portion of that might be if we inherit something from our elders. So that might be a way to gain wealth eventually by the time a lot of millennials will be in their 40s. But even though we may have to wait a while, perhaps the Great Wealth Transfer will benefit a lot of people in the coming decades. And if you also enjoy preparing for retirement, I hope you'll like and subscribe to my video and YouTube channel. And just know that we're all trying to figure this out. And I'm not the authority on all of this. I'm just a person on YouTube trying to understand what's going on with the complicated rules with inheriting IRAs. So I hope you'll keep that in mind and always consult with a professional tax advisor or estate planner if you need help in your personal situation. And let's get into some of the basics of inheriting IRAs and Roth IRAs. In the previous rule before the Secure Act, people who inherited these retirement accounts could spread out or stretch out their withdrawals throughout their lifetime, or what's also called the beneficiary's life expectancy. But the Secure Act brought a major change called the 10-year rule, which affects a lot of beneficiaries, which means that some people will have to withdraw all of the original owner's IRA funds by the end of the 10th year following the original IRA owner's death. So that means for those of us who are adult children, grandchildren, or a sibling, or other kinds of designated beneficiaries, will have to mostly comply with this 10-year rule if we stand to inherit an IRA. But if we are an eligible designated beneficiary, these are a special group which include the original owner's spouse, or a minor child and not an adult child, or a chronically ill or permanently disabled relative that can inherit the original owner's IRA. And those people have the ability to still withdraw throughout the beneficiary's life expectancy, which has its own special rule that I'll briefly talk about how that works if you were to calculate it that way. But for the most part, basically, let's say you're an adult child of a parent and that person unfortunately passed away in summer 2022, then that means you have until December 31, 2032 to be able to withdraw all of the funds in the original parent's IRA. So if it happened earlier in 2022 or at the end of 2022, you still have a full 10 years after the fact, plus give or take some months if it happened before December 31, to be able to take it out within those 10 years. So just keep that in mind. And for those to whom the 10-year rule applies, they originally interpreted that they could wait until the 10th year after the original owner passed away before they started having to make withdrawals. And that was based on the IRS's revision of Publication 590B in May 2021. But then in February 2022, the IRS issued new guidance saying that these heirs would have to make annual withdrawals if the original IRA owner had passed away either on or after their required beginning date of having to take required minimum distributions, which I know sounds like word salad, but basically means that typically nowadays, those who were born either on or after July 1, 1949, are turning 72 in 2021, and that means they need to start having required minimum distributions by April 1st, 2022. So if someone basically was 72 by the time it was 2022 and they passed away, that means anyone inheriting a 72-year-old's IRA these days will have to take annual distributions from that original IRA, unfortunately. And in contrast to how designated beneficiaries have to mostly comply with the 10-year rule or just take a lump sum distribution in the first year and deal with the tax charges in the first year, those who are eligible designated beneficiaries have the 10-year available to them as well, or other options like the life expectancy calculation, which I'll explain in the following example, where let's say a parent has a $100,000 traditional IRA account, and then they unfortunately pass away and their minor child is age 17, and per the IRS, the age of majority that the minor becomes an adult would be 21 in this tax example. So that means that this minor child has about 4 years to be able to do the life expectancy method calculation when withdrawing from their parents' IRA balance of $100,000. So that means if we go to the table of the single life expectancy, this 17-year-old is expected to live for another 68 years. And so you take 68 and divide that into $100,000, and you would get an annual payment amount of $1,471 as the minimum that they have to withdraw every year. And then they can do that until they reach the age of majority at 21. And then they only have 10 years to be able to withdraw the remaining balance. So they could keep doing that same annual withdrawal of $1,471 per year, or they could take it out at a faster pace, but they have to take it all out in another 10 years by the time they reach age 31. And that means that they're taking out the remaining balance of over $79,000 by that point in time. And also in a different example, if there was an eligible designated beneficiary, let's say someone who was chronically ill, who had inherited the original traditional IRA, and then if that person passes away, then someone else who's inheriting the chronically ill person's now inherited IRA has to do the 10-year rule when withdrawing the person's balance. So just also keep that in mind. And when I was searching for information about all the complicated rules when it comes to inheriting an IRA, the best resource I found was actually on Schwab. And this is not an endorsement of Schwab. It just happens to be really well organized. And they even have a beneficiary tool to help you figure out what are some of the withdrawal options you have available to you. And it's a free widget, so I encourage you to check it out. But I also came across their big list explaining by each type of either spouse or other eligible designated beneficiary, or if you're just a designated beneficiary, what are some of your withdrawal options? So I thought it was really well done and recommend reading through that article if you have these situations applied to you. And I went a step further and organized them into a spreadsheet so that I could know which options are available to each type of beneficiary. And the type that seems to have a pretty good deal and the most amount of options would be an original IRA owner spouse. And when it comes to either inheriting a traditional IRA or Roth IRA, the spouse can just transfer the IRA and make it their own. And that's a pretty decent deal because you have less rules to have to deal with if you go about it that way. So in addition to transferring your spouse's traditional IRA or Roth IRA and treating it as your own, there are a few more conditions, and you have 4 options of how you want to handle withdrawals if either your spouse was under 72 with a traditional IRA and also a Roth IRA. So these 4 options include, like I mentioned earlier, a spousal transfer or opening an inherited IRA using the life expectancy method, or also opening the inherited IRA with the 10-year method. And finally, the 4th option being the lump sum distribution. But if your spouse was over 72 and it's a traditional IRA, the only option that you don't have available is the 10-year method when it comes to opening an inherited IRA. And then if you are an eligible designated beneficiary, like I mentioned earlier, who's not a spouse but could be a minor child below 21, or someone who's chronically ill or permanently disabled, and also not more than 10 years younger than the decedent, like a sibling or a friend, then if the original account owner was under 72, you have 3 options of being able to open an inherited IRA with the life expectancy method or the 10-year method, or option 3, doing a lump sum distribution. And if the original account owner was over 72, you only have 2 options of opening an inherited IRA with the life expectancy method or doing number 2, a lump sum distribution. And then for only designated beneficiaries, the guidance from Schwab just says if you do not meet the requirements to be considered an eligible designated beneficiary, then if the account owner died after 2019, you will be required to fully distribute all assets by the end of the 10th year after the year the account holder died. And note, if the original account owner did not take an RMD or required minimum distribution in the year of death and they were required to, an RMD must be taken from the account by the end of December 31 of the year the original account holder died. And that applies to the traditional IRA. But then when it comes to Roth IRA and non-spousal inheritance, then with eligible designated beneficiaries who are not a spouse, you could have 3 options of the life expectancy method, the 10-year method, or the lump sum distribution. But then when it comes to designated beneficiaries in a Roth IRA, it gets a little bit confusing. And I have 3 sources with this where, according to Vanguard, Roth IRA owners don't need to take RMDs during their lifetimes, but beneficiaries who inherit Roth IRAs must take RMDs. But that seems in contrast to what 2 other sources said of Investopedia and Wall Street Journal, where per Investopedia, you do not have to take required minimum distributions every year, but you can make withdrawals whenever you like, just as long as you deplete the account within that 10-year period. And then per Wall Street Journal, inherited Roth IRA owners don't have to take payouts until the end of the 10-year period because Roth IRAs don't have annual payout requirements. So even though all of this is confusing, I'm sure the IRS will clear it all up when they come out with some of the final rules interpreting what the law really means. And so stay tuned, because depending on what the future rule says, some of this could be a little bit different when it comes to just regular designated beneficiaries like an adult child inheriting a parent's Roth IRA. So definitely be on the lookout if that were to change in the future. And let me know in the comments if you have any questions about any of this. I'd love to hear from you so that maybe I can research what some articles say about some of your questions, and so that I can also have a better understanding. And if you enjoyed this video or learned something, please like and subscribe. And I wish you well in figuring out retirement preparations, and wishing you all the best if you're able to benefit from the great wealth transfer in the coming decades. Till next time.